So when most people think about networking, they think of a client. So we have our client over here. So we've got a laptop here maybe, and it's showing a picture, keys and all that kind of stuff. And then we connect it to some kind of big giant fluffy cloud, which used to represent the internet, but now suddenly all of a sudden is just the cloud, but whatever. So this is the internet. And this connects to some kind of big giant server that sits in a room over here. And they send information back and forth. So this is, you have in the form of a client. The client sends what's called a request. And the server in turn sends back what's called a response. And this is how servers and clients work. They have a client over here, sends a request over to the server, and then the server sends a response back. But underneath the hood, what's actually happening is this server over here is actually just a piece of software. It's just a program that's running and waiting for things to connect to it. And similarly, this client over here is itself a program. But the whole thing altogether is actually referred to as client-server architecture. Server architecture. And client-server architecture actually is the client executable. So the client.exe plus the server.exe. So when you think about a web browser connecting to a web server, that's two components of the same piece of the same architecture. So if you have a client like a web browser, you connect to a web server, and that's where the sort of the mix and match comes in, or the sort of connection comes in. Now, if we're building our own server though, we need to create our own client. So that's a part of our software that goes out to the network and gets that information. And we also need to create a server part for our client-server architecture that accepts inbound communication. Now, the way that the internet works is when we send these out here, we're running a service over here. Now, this service has to have a known endpoint to it, and part of that is giving it a number. Now, for web servers, that number is port 80. So everything that we do is called a port in socket programming. So when we want to connect to an endpoint, we connect to the endpoint of port 80. If we want to connect to the web service, we want to connect to FTP, it's going to be port number 21, and so on for the various services. So we're going to create our own port number. Let's call it 54,000, which means that our client has to send an initial request to 54,000 over here. Now that port though is actually the listening port. Okay, so this is just waiting, this is the listening port. Oops, listen port. So that's a listen port. What actually happens is there's a little bit of a kind of to and fro, there's a conversation that happens between the client and the server, and they basically decide that this particular client and this particular server are now going to communicate across another set of ports. And those ports are the actual communication ports. So it might be that after the client the conversation's gone on there, it might actually be that this client here is connected on port, let's say it's local port 47125, some arbitrary number, and then this remote port might actually be 54121, something like that. Some random port number that's been generated. Well, not random port number, but it's from a pool of port numbers. So with that, we have our IP address here and the local port number, and we have our port number here and our our IP address of the server. And this here is actually what keeps the communication alive when we're using TCP. So we have our IP address for our client, our port number local to our client, and then we have our port number for our server and our IP address for our server. Now, this is going to be different for every single client that connects. They're going to get this unique set of values, which are 2 IP addresses and 2 port numbers. And this is going to form what's called a tuple, which is a collection of items. But we're still going to have our server listening on this port up here. Now, in our first server, the one that follows this video here, this is just the explanation video. Our first server, we're actually going to listen in on this port, and then we're going to close this port. So we're only ever going to have one thing connected. But as we build on this and we have multiple clients connecting, we're going to continue to listen on the port, but we're going to have multiple clients connected onto different sockets down here. Okay, so that's the sort of general theory of at least our networking portion. So yeah.